Thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible, not to delay you too much tonight because of the public transportation strikes. I have bad news for you. You have no identity, but the good news is that one can live without an identity, since you're right in front of me, alive and kicking, and neither do I have an identity. In order to convince you of this absence of identity, I'd like to have you think about what you've been doing since morning, since you woke up and since you got up, your relations with your relatives. Maybe you went to the mosque or to church, so therefore you're defined as a religious person. And then maybe you went to work. You might have various occupations, whether you're a member or not of MSF. Maybe you went to the dentist. This is also an identity that goes beyond to any other, transcending any other identity. And here you are here as an attendant, a listener, and therefore your identity is different from the one you had an hour ago when you were doing your work. You have an age, and therefore you have a personal history. And the way you define yourself today is certainly different from the one you would have defined you many years ago. And maybe, you will most likely die in some time from now, and you will be in the memory of those who will survive you. Therefore, it is to me almost impossible to summarize what I've just briefly described by this concept of identity, because at the end of the day, we all have different identities depending on the situations where we are. Now, this little flashback tells us three things. First of all, identity is an event rather than an essence. And I will refer to Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, who said that the concept shouldn't be telling the essence, but rather the event. Not a historical event such as the American Civil War, for instance, or François Ier, but rather something non-fixed in time, non-temporal. And in the trivial example that I just gave in my introduction to this presentation, you've probably understood that you're not carrying an identity essence, and that you have stopped defining your identity just because you were going or not going to Mass. And Freud never talks about identity, but rather about identification, because identity is indeed an event. And it's about what we are and how people see us in the present or in the future. So it's an event rather than an essence, as Deleuze has said. And it's always based on the situation, the setting, the context. We are identified in a particular context as a patient with the dentist, as a student at a university, as a believer in church, etc. So it's always in a particular context that we are identified, or that we identify ourselves. And by definition, because identification is always situational or contextual, it is always also based on relations. We always identify ourselves in relation to in relation to the doctor, in relation to a speaker, in relation to an audience, etc. And the identity talks far less about ourselves than our relations with others. It's always about the relation with others rather than about ourselves. So keep these three statements or items in mind, because I think that if we embed them in our reasoning, we will better understand why and how a political act or an economic action or a health-based action as a doctor, as a healthcare giver, this action will always have a cultural dimension. And paradoxically, the concept of culture and identity prevent us from understanding the cultural dimension that any action might have, even a medical action or a medical procedure. And I will give you a basic example. The very first political action in almost all societies is to kill your political enemy. The political crime exists in all societies, even in France. Even in France, as I was saying, we do have ministers who've been killed not that many years ago, a few decades ago. It has happened, and it's a basic political act. It's almost universal, but it always carries a cultural connotation, because the modus operandi meets symbols that fit with a given society. In Kenya, when you kill your political enemy, you cut this person into pieces. In the Kwekwe society, and as a journalist told me about the latest murder of a member of parliament in Kenya in the 1980s, he was found dead like a meatball. In France, this would not happen the same way. You wouldn't cut into pieces your political adversary. You wouldn't turn him into a meatball. In Sicily, in Italy, you would use the lupara, which is a special type of rifle, and then you would cast it in concrete. This is not what you would often find in France. So murder will always involve cultural symbols, and I will be even more accurate in a few minutes from that. The Kikuyu concept of murder doesn't mean that much to a French person, because not all the Kikuyus will cut their enemies and turn them into minced meat. And not all French people, or all those people who think that they're of French culture, will kill their enemies. And if they do so, they wouldn't do that in an overdetermined fashion.